Imagine losing everything you love only to find a stranger who changes your life in a single heartbeat. This is the story of two broken souls who dared to rewrite their destiny under the vast Wyoming sky. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Under the relentless sun of a Wyoming summer in 1887, the small town of Dust Creek shimmered like a mirage on the edge of the prairie. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and the faint hum of cicadas. Their song, a constant reminder of the unforgiving heat. Elias Whitaker, a man whose broad shoulders carried the weight of too many lonely years, guided his weathered wagon toward the Dust Creek trading post. His face, etched with lines from sun and sorrow, held no trace of the easy smile he'd once worn. 3 years ago, a brutal winter had stolen his wife, Clara, and their unborn child, leaving behind a ranch that felt more like a tomb than a home. Today he'd come for supplies, flour, nails, a new rope for the well, but his heart wasn't in it. The world had dulled since Clara's laughter no longer filled it. Elias pulled his hat low, shielding his eyes from the glare as the wagon creaked to a stop outside the trading post. Dust swirled around the wheels, settling like a fine veil over his boots. Inside his coat pocket, his fingers brushed against a small brass compass, a keepsake from Clara. She'd called it their North Star, a guide through life's storms. Now it was all he had left of her promises. He stepped down, his boots thudding against the hard-packed earth, and scanned the horizon. The prairie stretched endlessly, a sea of gold and green that seemed to mock his solitude. Somewhere out there, wolves prowled closer to his cattle, and the bank's latest letter, tucked unopened in his saddlebag, whispered of debts he couldn't pay. Elias was a man standing on the edge of ruin, and he knew it. Across the street, at the edge of Dust Creek's tiny train platform, a woman sat alone, her posture rigid despite the weight of defeat in her shoulders. Margaret Maggie Thornton, at 40 years old, had traveled over 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, chasing a dream that had crumbled before her eyes. She wore a faded emerald dress, its hem frayed from days of travel, and clutched a single leather satchel that held everything she owned. A week ago, she'd been a bride-to-be, promised to a prosperous merchant named Lawrence Tate. His letters had been filled with poetry, tales of a thriving store in Dust Creek, and vows of a life built together. But when Maggie arrived, Lawrence's sister had met her at the platform with cold eyes and a curt message. "My brother needs a wife who can bear heirs. At your age, that's unlikely. You should go back east." The words had stung like a slap, but Maggie's pride kept her chin high. She hadn't cried, not then, not now. Instead, she sat, staring at the tracks that stretched toward a future she no longer understood. The trading post was a bustle of activity, its wooden porch crowded with ranchers haggling over prices and children darting between barrels of grain. Elias nodded to Amos Reed, the grizzled storekeeper, who was busy weighing sacks of sugar. "Got my list, Amos," Elias said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the chatter around them. He handed over a scrap of paper, its edges curled from being folded too long in his pocket. Amos glanced at it, then at Elias, his eyes softening with the kind of pity Elias hated. "Rough year, ain't it, Whitaker? Heard the bank's been circling your place like vultures." Elias didn't reply, only tipped his hat and turned away, his gaze catching on the woman at the platform again. There was something about her, maybe the way she held herself like a tree refusing to bend in a storm, that tugged at a memory of Clara. He shook it off, but his feet were already moving toward the platform, as if drawn by a force he couldn't name. Maggie noticed the man approaching, his shadow falling across the warped boards of the platform before she saw his face. He was tall, with the kind of rugged strength that came from years of wrestling the land into submission. His eyes, a deep hazel flecked with gold, held a quiet intensity, like a man who'd seen too much but still searched for something worth finding. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Elias Whitaker. I don't mean to intrude, but you look like you've been waiting a while. Train's not due till Friday." His voice was rough, but there was a warmth to it, like embers glowing beneath ash. Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line, her guard up. She'd learned long ago that kindness often came with strings. "Margaret Thornton," she replied, her Philadelphia accent crisp despite the dust in her throat. "And I'm not waiting for a train, I'm deciding what comes next." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the truth she wasn't ready to admit. She had nowhere to go. Back in Philadelphia, her life as a seamstress had been respectable, but stifling, her days spent stitching dreams for others while her own faded. Lawrence's letters had been her escape, her chance at love. Now, that chance was gone, and the weight of it pressed against her chest. Elias shifted, his boots scuffing the platform. He wasn't sure why he'd stopped, why he felt compelled to speak to this stranger. Maybe it was the compass in his pocket, urging him toward a new direction. Or maybe it was the way her eyes, a soft gray like storm clouds, seemed to hold the same ache he carried. "Deciding's hard in a place like Dust Creek," he said, glancing at the horizon. "This land doesn't give you much time to think, but sometimes it gives you a chance to start over." He paused, then added, "If you're willing to take it." Maggie studied him, searching for the catch. Men didn't just offer hope to women like her, not at 40, not after being discarded like a worn-out dress. Yet there was no pity in Elias's gaze, only a quiet understanding that felt like a lifeline. The platform creaked beneath them, the sun beating down, and in that moment Dust Creek felt less like a dead end and more like a crossroads. Neither Elias nor Maggie could know that this fleeting encounter was about to rewrite their stories, that a single spark in the dust could ignite a flame to light their way. But as the prairie wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and possibility, one question hung unspoken between them. What if fate had other plans? The first light of dawn crept over the Wyoming prairie, painting the grasslands in hues of amber and blush. At the edge of Elias Whitaker's ranch, a modest spread of 150 acres nestled against a winding creek, the world stirred with the quiet rhythm of morning. Chickens clucked in their coop, a lone horse snorted in the barn, and the wind carried the faint howl of a distant coyote. But inside the ranch house, time seemed to stand still. Elias stood by the kitchen window, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee gone cold. The room was a shrine to what had been. Clara's embroidered dish towel hung on a peg. Her favorite blue teapot sat dusty on the shelf, and a small wooden music box, its tune long silenced, rested on the mantel. 3 years had passed since Clara's fever had taken her and their unborn child, but the ache in Elias's chest felt as raw as ever. He set the mug down, the clink of tin against wood echoing in the empty house. The floorboards groaned under his boots as he moved to the fireplace where a single photograph hung above the mantel. Clara's face smiled back at him, her dark curls spilling over her shoulders, her eyes bright with the laughter that had once filled this place. They'd taken the picture in Cheyenne, a rare trip to celebrate their 5th anniversary. "We've got forever, Eli," she'd whispered that day, her hand warm in his. Forever had lasted only 2 more years. Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the frame, then stopped. Touching it always felt like tempting fate, as if the memory might crumble under his grief. Outside, the ranch was waking. Caleb Morse, a lanky 19-year-old who'd become Elias's right-hand man, was already at work, his hammer ringing against a fence post in the south pasture. Caleb had come to the ranch a year ago, a runaway from a broken home in Colorado, and his tireless energy had kept the place from falling apart. But even Caleb's help couldn't outrun the drought that had scorched the land, or the bank's demands that grew sharper with each passing month. Elias pulled a crumpled letter from his coat pocket, its wax seal broken but its contents unread. He didn't need to open it to know the truth. The bank was closing in, and without Clara's knack for stretching every penny, the ranch was bleeding money. Flour was scarce, the well pump needed repairs, and the coyotes were growing bolder, their tracks circling closer to the cattle pens. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker." Caleb's voice cut through the morning haze as Elias stepped onto the porch. The boy was hauling a bucket of water from the creek, his freckled face smeared with dirt. "Found another coyote track near the east fence. Reckon we'll need more wire if we're going to keep 'em out." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. Wire cost money, and money was a ghost he couldn't catch. I'll add it to the list, he said, his tone heavier than he meant. Caleb hesitated, then added, Mail came yesterday too. Left it on the barn door. Looks important. Elias's stomach twisted. Another letter, another reminder of how close he was to losing everything Clara had loved. The morning passed in a blur of chores, mending a broken gate, checking the cattle for signs of disease, hauling hay to the barn. Every task felt like a battle against a world determined to wear him down. Elias's hands moved with the muscle memory of a man who'd worked this land for decades, but his mind wandered to Clara. She'd been the heart of this ranch, her sharp mind balancing the books, her gentle humor turning even the hardest days into something bearable. Without her, the numbers didn't add up, and the laughter had gone quiet. He paused by the creek, its water low from the drought, and pulled the brass compass from his pocket. Its needle spun lazily, as if it, too, had lost its way. What would you do, Clara? He whispered, the words swallowed by the wind. The creek babbled in response, offering no answers. Back at the house, Elias stood before a cracked mirror in the bedroom, attempting to tame his graying beard. His reflection was a stranger's, eyes sunken, cheeks hollowed by too many sleepless nights. The compass lay on the dresser, catching the morning light, and for a moment, he swore he saw Clara's smile in its polished surface. They'd dreamed of a bigger life here, a new barn, a family to fill the house, maybe even a school for the scattered children of neighboring ranches. Now those dreams felt like fairy tales, too fragile for the harsh reality of Dust Creek. He slipped the compass back into his pocket, its weight a quiet comfort, and grabbed his hat. The trip to the trading post couldn't wait. The ranch needed supplies, and Elias needed to face the world, even if it meant carrying his grief with him. As he hitched the horses to the wagon, Caleb appeared, wiping sweat from his brow. You sure you don't want me to come along, Mr. Whitaker? I could help with the heavy lifting. Elias shook his head. Mind the fences, Caleb. Those coyotes won't wait for me to get back. The boy nodded, but his eyes held a flicker of worry. Caleb had lost his own family to hardship, and though he never spoke of it, Elias recognized the shadow of loss in him. It was a bond they shared, unspoken but strong. I'll be back by dusk, Elias added, climbing onto the wagon seat. Keep that rifle close. The wagon rolled out, its wheels cutting fresh tracks in the dry earth. The prairie unfolded before him, vast and unyielding, its beauty a cruel contrast to the emptiness in his heart. Elias's hands tightened on the reins, the bank's letter burning a hole in his saddlebag, the compass a steady weight against his chest. He thought of the woman he'd seen at the trading post platform, her stillness haunting him in a way he couldn't explain. Dust Creek was a place where dreams came to die, but as the wagon rattled toward town, a strange feeling stirred in Elias's gut, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, the prairie had one more surprise in store. Could a man who'd lost his North Star find a new way to navigate the storms ahead? The train rattled across the endless Wyoming plains, its whistle a mournful cry against the twilight sky. Inside a cramped passenger car, Margaret Maggie Thornton sat by a smudged window, her fingers tracing the worn edges of a letter she'd read 100 times. The paper was soft from handling, its ink faded but still legible, each word a dagger to her heart. My dear Margaret, circumstances have changed. My family believes a woman of your years cannot fulfill our needs. Return to Philadelphia. Regrets, Lawrence. The words burned, not just for their cruelty, but for the hope they'd shattered. Maggie had left behind a safe, if stifling, life as a seamstress in Philadelphia, chasing a promise of love in Dust Creek. Now, at 40, she was a fool in a faded emerald dress, her dreams derailed as surely as if the train itself had jumped. The tracks. Beyond the window, the prairie unfolded in waves of gold and shadow, a stark contrast to the cobblestone streets and gaslit parlors of her old life. Maggie smoothed her skirt, its stitches a testament to her skill, each one precise, each one a silent rebellion against a world that told her she was too old for love. She'd spent years sewing wedding gowns for younger women, their giggles filling her shop while her own heart grew quiet. Then came Lawrence Tate's advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. Widowed merchant 45, seeks a refined companion for a life of mutual respect in Wyoming. Age no barrier, heart paramount. His letters had been a lifeline, filled with talk of books, dreams of a bustling store, and a future where Maggie's skills could shine. She'd poured her savings into this journey, stitching a new dress for the occasion, believing she was finally sewing her own happy ending. The train lurched, pulling Maggie from her thoughts. A young mother across the aisle hushed her fussing. Child and an elderly man coughed into a handkerchief, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Maggie envied their purpose, their destinations. Hers had vanished in Chicago, where Lawrence's sister had intercepted her with that devastating letter. "He needs heirs," the woman had said, her voice sharp as a needle. "You're past that time." Maggie had wanted to scream that love wasn't measured in years or children, that her heart was as full as any 20-year-old's. Instead, she'd nodded, her pride keeping her tears at bay, and boarded the next train west. Philadelphia held nothing for her now. No family, no prospects, just the echo of a life she'd outgrown. Something stubborn in her, a spark she'd nurtured through years of quiet disappointment, had pushed her onward to Dust Creek. Next stop, Dust Creek. The conductor's call sliced through the car, startling Maggie. She tucked the letter into her satchel, next to a small silver thimble her mother had given her years ago. A thimble for protection, her mother had said, because a woman's hands hold her future. Maggie had laughed then, but now the thimble felt like a talisman, a reminder that she could still shape her own path. She adjusted her bonnet, its ribbons frayed from travel, and caught her reflection in the window. Her gray eyes, once bright with ambition, were shadowed by doubt, but there was a firmness to her jaw that hadn't wavered. At 40, she was no longer the girl who dreamed of grand romances, but she was a woman who knew her worth, even if the world didn't. The train slowed, steam hissing like whispered secrets. Dust Creek came into view, a scattering of clapboard buildings, a church steeple piercing the sky, and a trading post where men in wide-brimmed hats bartered under the midday sun. This was to have been her home, where she'd walk arm in arm with Lawrence, her needle and thread turning his store into a hub of community. Instead, she stepped onto the platform alone, her satchel heavy in her hand. The air was dry, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and the platform creaked under her boots. A few townsfolk glanced her way, their curiosity sharp but fleeting. Maggie made her way to a weathered bench, its paint peeling like the fragments of her plans. She sat, the letter in her satchel a silent accusation, and stared at the tracks stretching east. Going back was an option, but it felt like surrender. A boy delivering water to the station paused, his bucket sloshing. "You waitin' for someone, ma'am?" he asked, his voice high with youth. Maggie shook her head, managing a small smile. "Just catching my breath," she lied. The boy nodded and moved on, leaving her to the quiet of her thoughts. She'd sent her trunk ahead to Lawrence's store, a mistake she now regretted. It held her tools, her fabrics, the dress she'd sewn for a wedding that would never happen. Retrieving it would mean facing Lawrence or his sister, a humiliation she wasn't ready for. Yet staying here, with no money and no plan, was its own kind of defeat. Maggie's fingers tightened around her satchel, the thimble inside pressing against her palm. She'd sewn through worse storms than this, clients who didn't pay, winters with no coal. But this felt different, like a seam she couldn't mend. The platform grew quieter as the train pulled away, its whistle fading into the distance. Maggie's gaze drifted to the trading post across the street, where a man in a worn coat was unloading his wagon. He'd spoken to her earlier, Elias Whitaker, with eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. His words about starting over had lingered, a thread she wasn't sure she dared to pull. Philadelphia had taught her caution, but the prairie was a place of bold choices where survival meant taking risks. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the platform, Maggie felt a stirring in her chest, a whisper of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Could a woman, who'd lost her way, find a new pattern to stitch her life together? The Dust Creek trading post buzzed with the rhythm of a small town clinging to life. Barrels of molasses and sacks of flour lined the porch, while ranchers bartered for ammunition and women traded gossip over bolts of calico. Elias Whitaker stood by his wagon, his hands busy unloading a sack of grain, but his eyes kept drifting to the woman on the train platform. Margaret Thornton, Maggie, she'd called herself, sat like a statue carved from resolve, her emerald dress catching the afternoon sun. There was a quiet strength in her stillness, a defiance that reminded Elias of Clara in her fiercest moments. He didn't know her story, but he recognized the weight of loss in her posture, the same shadow that haunted his own reflection. Something stirred in him, a pull he hadn't felt in years, urging him to cross the dusty street. Inside the trading post, Amos Reed, the storekeeper, was rattling off prices, his ledger open on the counter. "Wolves been at your cattle again, Whitaker?" he asked, eyeing Elias's supply list. "Heard they're getting bold this summer." Elias nodded, his voice low. "Coyotes mostly. Need more wire for the fences." Amos scribbled a note, then leaned closer, his tone dropping. "Saw you looking at that lady over there. Word is she came for Lawrence Tate's proposal, but his sister sent her packing. Said she's too old to give him kids. Shame if you ask me." Elias's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking in his chest. He'd never met Tate, but the man's absence spoke volumes. To abandon a woman after summoning her across the country, it was a coward's move, plain and simple. Elias stepped back onto the porch, the bank's letter still unopened in his saddlebag, its weight a constant reminder of his own crumbling world. The platform was just a stone's throw away, and Maggie hadn't moved, her satchel resting like a loyal companion at her side. He hesitated, the brass compass in his pocket suddenly heavy. Clara had always said the heart knew its path before the mind caught up. Maybe that's why his boots were already carrying him toward the platform, dust rising with each step. As he approached, Maggie looked up, her gray eyes sharp but wary, like a deer sizing up a stranger in the brush. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice steady despite the faintest tremble. "Did I forget something earlier?" "No, ma'am," Elias replied, touching the brim of his hat. He shifted, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. "I just noticed you're still here. Dust Creek's not much for lingering unless you've got a reason." He gestured to the platform, empty now save for a few scattered crates. Maggie's lips quirked, not quite a smile. "I suppose I'm looking for one," she said, her Philadelphia accent crisp against the drawl of the prairie. "Though reasons seem hard to come by today." Her honesty caught him off guard, a raw edge that mirrored his own unspoken truths. He settled onto the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance, and pulled the compass from his pocket, turning it in his hands. "My wife Clara gave me this," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Called it our North Star. Said it'd guide us through anything, but I've been lost since she passed." He paused, glancing at Maggie. "I don't know your story, Miss Thornton, but I reckon you're feeling a bit lost yourself." Maggie's fingers tightened around her satchel, the silver thimble inside pressing against her palm. She hadn't expected this, a rancher with eyes like a storm, offering not pity but understanding. "I came here for a marriage that didn't happen," she admitted, her words measured. "Thought I'd found someone who saw me, not just my years. Turns out I was wrong." The confession hung between them, fragile but unyielding, like a thread waiting to be woven into something stronger. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the compass. Losing someone, whether to fever or foolishness, it leaves a hole nothing fills. But Clara used to say the prairie's got a way of mending what's broken, if you give it a chance. Maggie studied him, searching for the catch. Men didn't speak like this, not to women like her, not after a lifetime of being overlooked. Yet there was no guile in Elias's face, only a quiet sincerity that felt like a door cracking open. "And what do you think, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked, her voice softer now. Does the prairie mend or does it just bury? He met her eyes, and for a moment the noise of Dust Creek faded. The clatter of wagons, the shouts of children, the creak of the platform. I think it depends on whether you're willing to dig, he said. I've got a ranch 10 miles out, struggling like most in these parts. It's not much, but it's honest work. And I've learned there's a difference between living and just getting by. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Maggie's breath catch. She thought of the thimble, her mother's gift, a symbol of shaping her own future. Could she dare to believe in a new beginning? The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the platform. Elias stood, the compass glinting in his hand. Miss Thornton, I know we're strangers, but I've seen enough of life to know when something feels right. I'm not offering charity or a rescue. I'm offering a partnership, a chance for both of us to stop running from our ghosts. Maggie's heart pounded, a mix of fear and possibility. She'd come to Dust Creek for one man's promise only, to find another's. Are you saying what I think you're saying, Mr. Whitaker? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying, Elias replied, his hazel eyes steady, that any man who'd let you go for being too old doesn't deserve the strength you carry. I'm saying I'd be honored to walk beside you if you're willing to take a chance on a rancher with more scars than sense. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Maggie looked at the tracks stretching east, then back at Elias, his compass catching the last rays of sunlight. The prairie was vast, unforgiving, but in that moment it felt like a place where two broken threads could be woven into something whole. What would happen if she said yes to a man who saw not her years, but her heart? The Dust Creek Courthouse was little more than a squat wooden building, its walls weathered by years of prairie winds. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old ledgers, and a single window let in a shaft of late afternoon light that danced across the floor. Elias Whitaker stood at the clerk's desk, his broad frame steady but his heart racing like a Mustang on the run. Beside him, Margaret Maggie Thornton clutched her satchel, her emerald dress now dusted with the day's travel, but her gray eyes alight with a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Moments ago, on the train platform, Elias had offered her not just a lifeline but a partnership, a chance to build a life together, not out of pity but out of shared strength. Maggie had said yes, her voice trembling but sure, and now they stood here, two strangers on the cusp of a vow that would change everything. Clerk Jonah Haskell, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his paperwork, his pen frozen mid-stroke. A marriage license today? He stammered, glancing between Elias and Maggie as if they'd sprouted wings. Mr. Whitaker, I've known you since you and Clara settled that ranch, but this, well, it's mighty sudden. Elias's hand brushed the brass compass in his pocket, a quiet reminder of Clara's belief in bold choices. Sudden don't mean wrong, Jonah, he said, his voice calm but firm. Miss Thornton and I know what we're about. Maggie lifted her chin, her seamstress's hands steady despite the weight of the moment. We're not here for doubts, Mr. Haskell, she added, her Philadelphia accent cutting through the room's stillness. We're here to make a promise. The clerk fumbled with a fresh form, his hands shaking as he dipped his pen in ink. Outside, the news was spreading like wildfire through Dust Creek's small community. Amos Reed, the storekeeper, had overheard Elias's request for a witness and was already fetching Reverend Clara Mayhew, a no-nonsense preacher known for her fiery sermons and kind heart. By the time Amos returned, the courthouse steps were crowded with curious townsfolk, ranchers pausing their errands, women clutching baskets of eggs, and children peeking through the crowd, their faces smudged with dirt and wonder. Maggie felt their stares, a mix of skepticism and intrigue, but she refused to falter. She'd faced worse judgments in Philadelphia, where her age had branded her a spinster. Here, under the vast Wyoming sky, she was rewriting her story. Reverend Mayhew burst through the door, her gray hair pinned in a hasty bun, her Bible tucked under one arm. Elias Whitaker, you old coyote, she said, her voice warm with affection. When Amos said you were getting hitched, I thought he'd been sipping moonshine. Her eyes softened as they landed on Maggie. And you must be Miss Thornton. Takes a brave soul to step into Dust Creek and turn it upside down in a day. Maggie managed to smile, her fingers brushing the silver thimble in her satchel. I'm not sure about turning anything upside down, Reverend, she said. Just hoping to stitch something new. The preacher nodded, her gaze approving. Well, let's make it official then. The ceremony was held right there in the courthouse, too urgent for the church's formalities. Amos and Jonah served as witnesses, their signatures scrawled on the license with a flourish. The townsfolk crowded the doorway, their whispers a soft hum against the creak of the floorboards. Maggie's trunk still at Tate's store held the cream-colored gown she'd sewn for a wedding that never was, but she didn't want it now. That dress belonged to a dream built on someone else's promises. Today she stood in her travel-worn emerald dress, its frayed hem a badge of her journey, and felt more like a bride than she ever had. Elias, in his worn coat and scuffed boots, looked at her with a quiet intensity that made her heart skip. In his eyes, she wasn't a discarded spinster but a woman of fire and grit, worthy of standing beside him. Reverend Mayhew opened her Bible, but her words came from the heart, not the page. Dearly beloved, she began, her voice carrying to the rafters. We're here to witness a miracle, not just a marriage, but a moment when two souls choose hope over heartache. Elias and Margaret have known loss, but today they're choosing to build something new, to trust that the prairie can mend what's been broken. She paused, her eyes twinkling. Now, I reckon some of you think this is plumb crazy, but I say love don't wait for permission. It strikes like lightning, and only the brave dare to catch it. The crowd murmured, a few women dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs. A young girl, no older than 10, slipped through the doorway and pressed a small bouquet of prairie asters into Maggie's hands, their purple petals vibrant against her dress. For you, ma'am, the girl whispered, her braids bouncing as she darted back to her mother. Maggie's throat tightened, the unexpected kindness nearly undoing her composure. She looked at Elias, who gave her a small nod, his hand steady at her elbow. They had no rings, such things hadn't crossed their minds in the whirlwind of the moment, but Amos stepped forward, pulling a simple silver band from his pocket. Belonged to my late wife, he said gruffly. She'd want it used for something good. A woman from the crowd, Mrs. Delaney, offered her own gold band, its surface worn but warm. My grandmother's, she said. For luck. Elias took the silver ring, his fingers brushing Maggie's as he slid it onto her hand. Margaret Thornton, he said, his voice low but clear. I vow to stand by you, to honor your strength, and to build a life where we both can find our way. I ain't perfect, but I'm yours if you'll have me. Maggie's breath caught, the weight of the ring grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She took the gold band, her seamstress's fingers steady as she placed it on Elias's hand. Elias Whitaker, she replied, her voice ringing with conviction. I vow to walk with you, to mend what we can, and to face whatever storms come. I choose this life, and I choose you. The words felt like stitches binding their broken pieces into something whole. Reverend Mayhew's smile was radiant. By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined, let no man tear asunder. The room erupted in cheers, the townsfolk clapping and stomping their feet, their doubts swept away by the raw beauty of the moment. Elias leaned in, his lips brushing Maggie's in a kiss that tasted of dust and promise, soft but sure. The prairie asters in her hands seemed to glow, their petals a silent vow of their own. As they turned to face the crowd, Maggie caught sight of Lawrence Tate's sister at the edge of the group, her face a mask of disapproval. Maggie held her gaze, her chin high, and felt a surge of triumph. This was her moment, her choice, her beginning. The courthouse door swung open, letting in a gust of warm air that carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Elias and Maggie stepped onto the steps hand in hand, the borrowed rings glinting in the fading light. The townsfolk followed, their voices a chorus of congratulations, their faces alight with the kind of hope that only a small town could muster. Dust Creek was a place of hard truths, But it was also a place where miracles could take root, where two strangers could become one in the span of a single day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of fire and gold, a question lingered in the air. Could a vow made in haste become a love that would last? The Whitaker Ranch sprawled across the Wyoming prairie like a patchwork quilt, its 150 acres stitched together by weathered fences and the stubborn will of those who called it home. As the first light of autumn crept over the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of copper and rose, Maggie Whitaker stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. Her emerald dress had been traded for a practical calico skirt and blouse, but the silver thimble in her pocket remained, a quiet reminder of the life she'd left behind. 3 weeks had passed since her impulsive wedding to Elias Whitaker, and in that time, the ranch had begun to transform from a monument to grief into a place of possibility. The air carried the scent of fresh-turned earth and baking bread, signs that Maggie was weaving her own thread into the fabric of this new life. Inside the house, the kitchen was alive with the hum of purpose. Maggie had scrubbed the dusty shelves, polished Clara's blue teapot until it gleamed, and hung new curtains sewn from fabric bought at the Dust Creek trading post. The wooden music box on the mantel, once silent, now played a soft, halting tune, its gears coaxed back to life by Maggie's patient hands. She'd found it buried in a trunk, along with Clara's recipe book, its pages filled with notes in a looping script. Clara loved her biscuits, Elias had said one evening, his voice thick with memory as Maggie kneaded dough by lamplight. She'd be pleased to see this kitchen alive again. Maggie had smiled, her heart swelling at the thought of honoring the woman who'd shaped this home before her. She wasn't here to replace Clara, but to build on the love that still lingered in these walls. The ranch itself was stirring under Maggie's touch. She'd turned a crumbling shed into a sewing workshop, its shelves lined with bolts of fabric and spools of thread. Neighbors began trickling in, trading eggs or firewood for Maggie's deft repairs. Mended shirts, patched quilts, even a wedding dress for a shy rancher's daughter. The extra income eased the pressure of the bank's looming threats, and Maggie's ledger, kept with a seamstress's precision, brought order to the ranch's tangled finances. "You've got a gift for numbers," Elias remarked one morning, peering over her shoulder as she balanced the books. Maggie laughed, her gray eyes sparkling. "Sewing's just math with a needle, Elias. Every stitch has to count." Her practicality was a balm to the ranch's wounds, but it was her warmth that began to heal its heart. Life on the prairie wasn't without its trials. One stormy night, a gust of wind tore through the north pasture, splintering a fence and sending half the cattle bolting toward a rocky gulch. Maggie, who'd only just learned to ride, grabbed an oilskin coat and followed Elias and Caleb Morse, the young ranch hand, into the rain. Lightning cracked overhead, turning the sky into a jagged canvas, but Maggie's voice cut through the chaos, steady and sure. "Turn 'em back, Caleb, head for the creek," she shouted, her horse slipping in the mud but her resolve unshaken. Together they corralled the herd, Elias's shouts mingling with Maggie's commands, their teamwork, a dance born of necessity. When the last steer was safe, Elias looked at her, rain streaming down his face, and grinned. "City woman or not, you're a rancher now, Maggie Whitaker." Her laughter rang out, a sound brighter than the storm. Back at the house, Maggie and Elias shared quiet moments that wove their lives closer. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Maggie showed him a quilt she was piecing together, its patches cut from her old Philadelphia dresses and Elias's worn work shirts. "It's our story," she said, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Every piece tells where we've been, where we're going." Elias traced a square of blue calico, his fingers lingering. "Clara started a quilt once," he said softly. "Never finished it, maybe you could—" He trailed off, but Maggie understood. She reached for his hand, the borrowed silver ring glinting on her finger. "We'll finish it together," she promised, her voice a thread binding past to present. The community of Dust Creek began to embrace Maggie, their initial skepticism giving way to admiration. Mrs. Delaney, who'd lent her grandmother's ring, invited Maggie to a sewing circle, where women swapped stories and stitches under the shade of a cottonwood tree. Amos Reed sent his daughter Lila to learn mending, and soon other children followed, their chatter filling the workshop with life. Maggie taught them not just to sew but to dream, sharing tales of Philadelphia's bustling markets and Wyoming's untamed beauty. You can make anything, she told them, her thimble catching the sunlight. A dress, a home, a life, it's all in how you piece it together. The children's parents, grateful for her influence, began calling her Miss Maggie, a title that felt like a badge of belonging. Yet challenges loomed. The bank's letters grew more insistent, and coyotes prowled closer, their howls a nightly reminder of the ranch's fragility. One morning, as Maggie and Elias repaired a broken gate, she broached a bold idea. "What if we turned the old barn loft into a boarding room?" she asked, her breath visible in the crisp air. "There's ranchers' kids too far out to ride daily. We could teach them here, sewing, reading, figures. It'd bring in money, maybe enough to keep the bank at bay." Elias paused, his hammer still, and looked at her with a mix of awe and pride. "You're full of surprises, Maggie," he said. "Clara always wanted a school. Reckon she'd be cheering you on." The idea took root, a spark of hope in a season of uncertainty. As autumn deepened, the ranch bloomed with small victories. The vegetable garden, once choked with weeds, now sprouted rows of late carrots and turnips thanks to Maggie's tireless hands. The cattle pens stood stronger, reinforced with wire bought from her sewing earnings. And in the quiet of evening, Elias began to open up, sharing stories of Clara's love for stargazing, her habit of singing to the horses. Maggie listened, her heart full, and shared her own tales, of her mother's thimble, her years stitching dreams for others. Their borrowed rings, still warm from their previous owners, felt less like placeholders and more like promises kept. The ranch was no longer just Elias's. It was theirs, a tapestry woven from loss, love, and the courage to begin again. But, as the first frost kissed the prairie, a new question loomed. Could their fragile new home withstand the storms that waited on the horizon? 1 year to the day after their whirlwind wedding, the Dust Creek train platform was alive with the hum of celebration. The August sun hung low, casting a golden glow over the weathered boards where Elias Whitaker and Maggie Whitaker stood hand in hand, their faces radiant with a joy hard-earned. The platform, once a place of heartbreak for Maggie, was now transformed, draped with garlands of prairie asters and sagebrush, its edges lined with townsfolk who'd become family. Children darted through the crowd, clutching baskets of wildflowers, while women in calico dresses fanned themselves and men tipped their hats in respect. This wasn't just an anniversary. It was a testament to a love that had bloomed against all odds, a promise kept under the vast Wyoming sky. Elias wore a new coat, its stitches a gift from Maggie's needle, and his hazel eyes sparkled with a lightness Dust Creek hadn't seen in years. Maggie stood beside him, her practical blouse replaced by a soft blue dress she'd sewn herself, its hem embroidered with tiny asters, a nod to the bouquet that had marked their wedding day. In her pocket, the silver thimble rested, no longer a shield but a symbol of the life she'd crafted. The borrowed rings they'd worn for a year, Amos's silver band and Mrs. Delaney's gold, had been gratefully returned, replaced by new ones they'd chosen together. Crafted by a Cheyenne silversmith, the rings bore engravings of sagebrush, a quiet tribute to the prairie that had brought them together. As they faced the crowd, the brass compass in Elias's pocket felt warm, as if Clara herself were smiling down on them. Reverend Clara Mayhew stepped forward, her Bible tucked under her arm but her words flowing freely. "Folks," she began, her voice ringing across the platform, "we're here to celebrate Elias and Maggie Whitaker, two souls who dared to trust in love when the world told them to give up. A year ago they stood right here, strangers bound by courage. Today they stand as partners, their love a beacon for us all." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of awe and pride. Amos Reed, now a steadfast friend, wiped his eyes with a bandana, while Mrs. Delaney beamed, her grandmother's ring back on her finger but its legacy alive in Maggie's hands. Even Lawrence Tate's sister lingered at the crowd's edge, her stern features softened by the undeniable truth of the Whitakers' bond. The celebration was a community affair, as only Dust Creek could muster. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, venison stew, cornbread, and Maggie's biscuits, baked from Clara's recipe but with her own touch of honey. Children scattered petals, their laughter mingling with the strum of a fiddler's tune. Maggie's sewing workshop had become a hub of the town, its earnings helping the ranch clear its debts and fund a new barn loft. Now a boarding room for 3 ranchers' children who studied under Maggie's care. She taught them to read, to sew, to balance a ledger, her lessons weaving dreams into practical skills. Elias, too, had changed, his once silent ranch now a place of warmth, its garden thriving with Maggie's carrots and turnips, its fences standing tall against the coyotes' prowls. As the sun dipped lower, Elias and Maggie renewed their vows, their voices steady and sure. "Maggie," Elias said, sliding the new sagebrush-engraved ring onto her finger. "You brought light to my shadows, life to my home. I vow to love you, to honor you, and to thank the stars every day for that platform where we met." Maggie's gray eyes shimmered, her hand trembling as she placed the matching ring on his. "Elias," she replied, "you saw me when I felt invisible. I vow to stand by you, to stitch our dreams together, and to build a future as wide as this prairie." The crowd erupted in cheers, the fiddler striking up a lively reel, and the children showered them with asters, their petals drifting like promises in the breeze. Reverend Mayhew raised her hands, silencing the crowd. "Before we dance the night away," she said, "let's take a moment to learn from this love." In the 1880s, Wyoming was more than a frontier. It was a crucible where women like Maggie redefined their roles. Many came west as mail-order brides, seeking not just husbands, but agency, a chance to shape their own destinies. Communities like Dust Creek thrived because of their grit, their skills, whether sewing, teaching, or ranching, building not just homes but legacies. Maggie's story reminds us that love and courage were the true currency of the Wild West, forging bonds that time can't break. Her words hung in the air, a bridge between past and present, resonating with the history lovers in the crowd. As the fiddler played on, Maggie caught sight of sagebrush sprouting near the platform's edge, its silver-green leaves a mirror of their rings. Whether carried by the wind or planted by some unseen hand, it stood as a symbol of their love, resilient, unexpected, rooted in the harshest of soils. Elias followed her gaze and squeezed her hand, his smile a silent vow. Dust Creek had been their crossroads, their crucible, and now it was their home. The platform clock ticked above them, no longer counting the hours until it trained back east, but marking the moments of a life rich with purpose. The crowd began to dance, their shadows swaying under the stars, and Maggie leaned into Elias, her heart full. Their story wasn't finished, only beautifully begun. What new chapters would the prairie write for a love that had conquered time itself? And if this tale of courage and love touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to join our Dust Creek family. Ring the bell so you don't miss our next Wild West story where history and romance collide. Tell us in the comments, what's a moment that changed your life forever? We can't wait to read your stories.